As the sun rose over Stellenbosch, a man woke up disoriented. The first thing he noticed was the pain from his head. He struggled to make sense of his surroundings, realizing he was lying beside a gravel road, but unable to identify exactly where he was. The last thing he remembered was laying on the ground, his head resting on a brick while two men were over him, each holding half a brick in their hands. Searching for signs of anyone from the night before, he found himself alone and able to move. His face and his upper body was covered in blood. He started running desperately to find help. Spotting a nearby house, he headed towards it, jumped the wall surrounding the property without a second thought. Reaching the door, he knocked desperately, begging for assistance from anyone but the residents. Looking at the condition the man was in, chased him away and called the police. When officers arrived, they took him to the nearby hospital. A series of tests revealed the man had a fractured skull, deafness in his left ear, and fracture to his hand, likely caused by a heavy blow from an external object. The man was Cheslin Marsh, a student of Stellenbosch University and the resident of the city. The police tried to gather information on how he ended up in his current state. The story Cheslin told baffled the police. It was so bizarre and horrifying, even the police were shocked. It became clear that Cheslin's friend, who has been with him from the previous night, might be in even greater danger, with her life potentially at risk. Stellenbosch, often called the city of oaks for its abundance of oak trees, is a picturesque town in South Africa, Western Cape province. Located approximately 50 kilometers or 31 miles east of Cape Town, it rests along the banks of Eerste River, nestled at the base of the Stellenbosch mountain. The city is famous for its Stellenbosch University, which has produced great minds. Hannah Cornelius was also a student of the Stellenbosch University. Hannah was bright and kind. She was always trying to help others whenever possible and basically a joy to be around. Hannah was looking forward to a bright future. On the evening of May 27, 2017, there was a party held at Stellenbosch University. The party was filled with laughter and music. Everyone was having a blast while others were chatting in the corner. Cheslin Marsh was also part of the party that day. As the clock neared 2:30 a.m., Cheslin decided it was time to leave. Realizing it was getting late, just as he was about to head out, he was approached by Hannah. Hannah was also part of the party that day and she insisted on driving Cheslin home to his apartment as it was dark outside and Cheslin wanted to walk to his home. Hannah and Cheslin decided to leave the party together and he got into Hannah's car, an old Volkswagen City Golf. Hannah took the driver's seat while Cheslin sat beside her in the front passenger seat. They drove to Jan Cheslin Street, that's where Cheslin lived. They both stayed in the car and were chatting for a while. While Cheslin was about to leave the car, he noticed a hand holding a screwdriver beside Hannah through the window, who was in the driver's seat. Cheslin was about to grab the hand with the screwdriver, and the door on his side opened where a stranger placed a knife on his neck and said, "Don't move or you'll die." Cheslin was taken out of the vehicle and pushed into the back seat. Now Cheslin is sitting in the back seat with two strangers who he has never seen in his life. The strangers started taking his cell phone, wallet, his cards, and a diamond earring that he was wearing. Hannah was pushed into the middle of the front two seats by the guy holding the screwdriver, and the person holding the knife was sitting in the passenger's side of the front seat. These strangers started driving the car. Now Hannah and Cheslin, they don't know what they're going to do to them, or they could speak with each other. They were both college students, scared for their lives, and could have thought listening to these people might be the best way to escape this nightmare. Hannah, even though she was scared, she was able to ask where they were going, to which one of the guys replied they were just going into the city, and after reaching the city they will drop them and leave them. Hannah's heart was pounding in her chest. She always had been a brave and a kind person, but now she felt powerless, her body frozen with fear. Cheslin, in the back seat, was no better. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling at the reality of the situation sank in. Both were young students, accustomed to university life, but this was a nightmare far beyond anything they had ever imagined. As they drove further into the road, each passing second dragged them deeper and deeper into the nightmare. They stopped the car at one place, somewhere far from where they were kidnapped. They yanked Cheslin out of the car with brute force, ripping him off of his jacket and ordering him to remove his shoes. And then they forced him into the boot of the vehicle. One of the men demanded Cheslin card's pin, to which he agreed and gave the pin to him. Then they drove to the nearby ATM to withdraw the cash from Cheslin's card, but they failed because Cheslin has given them a fake pin, which angered them more. Cheslin had no idea where they were taking him. The boot was so dark he couldn't see anything. But from the voices outside, he could tell. They knew he had lied about the pin. He also heard them talking about a merchant, which made him even more worried. Then they drove to another place and they stopped. Cheslin doesn't know exactly where they are up until then. He hadn't heard anything from Hannah. She hasn't said a single word. And Cheslin couldn't tell what was happening to her. But after stopping the vehicle, he heard another guy saying, "We can't leave the girl alone." She was trapped in the car with no way to alert anyone. Her cell phone had been taken from her, leaving her powerless and alone. Forced into silence, she couldn't do anything but endure the terror of being driven wherever the strangers chose to take her. All she wanted was the nightmare to end. One of the four guys left the group after robbing the cell phone of Cheslin, and the remaining three brought Hannah to the shack where they could buy some Tick Lolly, a street name for methamphetamine, a powerful and a dangerous drug. Hannah was forced to come into the shack with the three kidnappers. She had no choice but to sit there, helpless, while the man and the others in the shack used drugs around her. After using the drugs, the group, along with the new guy from the shack, got back into the car and started driving. Cheslin, still locked in the dark mood, could hear Hannah's voice. She was asking where they were going to the strangers, but he couldn't make out what the strangers were actually telling her. Then they drove for what felt like a long time, and then the car suddenly shifted as it drove into a gravel road. Cheslin could feel the rough, bumpy ride under the car, and he knew they were somewhere unfamiliar. The car finally stopped again. This time the boot opened and they pulled Cheslin out. He was dragged out of the car and shoved into some bushes. Panic spread through him, trying to make sense of what's happening, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what they were going to do next. Cheslin was paralyzed with fear. He doesn't know what they were going to do to him. They ordered him to lay his head on a brick on the ground. That's when he had a sinking feeling of what was about to happen. He had never been in a situation like this before. All he wanted that night was to go home, sleep, and attend college the next morning. But now he was kidnapped by four strangers, robbed, and facing an uncertain fate. He was forced to lay on the ground. The last thing he was able to see was two strangers with half bricks in their hands. Cheslin did what he could do best at that time. He closed his eyes and started praying to God. The strangers hit his head with the brick, and the next moment he was unconscious. After the two men returned to the car, Hannah sat there completely unaware of what happened to Cheslin. Fear gripped her. She could only imagine the worst. Her mind raced with countless thoughts of her family, her friends, her college life, uncertain of whether she would ever see any of them again. The terror she felt was overwhelming, and she was terrified for her own life. They drove for a while, and they stopped the car at a secluded spot near a paintball site in Bottleray Road. Hannah was taken out of the car, and the three people out of the four who were in the car pushed Hannah into a bush nearby at that spot, and they started assaulting her, one after the other. She was powerless, trapped in her own fear. After what felt like an eternity, they finally brought her back to the car. She was shoved into the back seat. While she collapsed in tears, her body was trembling from the shock and pain. After about 12 miles, they stopped again, this time on a quiet farm road next to a stream and a vineyard. The door opened once more, and the men ordered her to get out. They forced Hannah to come outside the vehicle. She was holding onto the seat, refusing to get out. In the moment of desperate resistance, one of the men drew a knife, and before she could react, he plunged it deep into her neck twice. Blood started pouring from her wounds, gasping and choking on her own blood. As she fell to the ground, one of these monsters found a boulder which was almost 2 feet wide, weighing 85 pounds, lifted it up, and he brought the boulder crashing onto her face. As she lay there, barely able to move, they raised the boulder again, slamming it down once more with brutal force. It was around 7 to 7:30 a.m., and Hannah's life had been stolen from her in the most gruesome and terrifying way imaginable. Hannah was in their custody from the midnight of 27 until the early hours of the following morning, enduring unimaginable horrors up until the moment of her demise. The monsters didn't stop there with Hannah. It was later reported that they had also robbed two other women from the same Stellenbosch area. One of the women was kidnapped, but thankfully she was released unharmed. By this time, the information had been relayed to the police. One of the officers on duty managed to locate the vehicle and began pursuing it. After a tense and dramatic chase, 2 of the 4 suspects were caught. The remaining 2 were eventually apprehended, bringing the pursuit to a close. Here are the 4 culprits responsible for the brutal torture and harm inflicted on both Cheslin and Hannah. The court handed down a combined prison sentence of 358 years, with 3 of the 4 receiving life sentences for their horrific actions. Unfortunately, The news shattered Hannah's parents, who had pinned all their hopes and dreams on their beloved daughter. The pain of losing her was unimaginable, a cruel blow that crushed their hearts. They struggled to keep the news from their autistic son, not knowing how to explain the loss of his sister. The weight of their grief was unbearable as they tried to navigate a world that had forever been changed. In March 2018, tragedy struck once more when Anna, Hannah's mother, was found dead in a pool in Scarborough, Cape Town. The loss of her daughter had already shattered her, and it seemed the weight of that grief was too much to bear. Mr. Cornelius, too, faced unimaginable pain. After being diagnosed with cancer, he endured a long and painful battle, ultimately passing away in 2022. Both the parents started Hannah Cornelius Foundation in support to bring down the violence in the area. You could also support using the link in the description. Little is known about Andreas, Hannah's brother, who was left to cope with the unimaginable loss of his sister and parents. As for Cheslin, the trauma he endured was so overwhelming, he was forced to drop out of college. Later, with the support of people, he was able to get back into the studies and is currently pursuing his law degree.